All right, I think everyone has had a chance to join us now. Welcome to the Strater cross-section crash course webinar. Hi everyone, my name is Drew and I will be your presenter for today's webinar. I'm here today to give you the lowdown on how to create cross-sections from various data types and various log types in Strater. This is a very common workflow in Strater, and we see a lot of our users execute these tools to create these types of data visualizations. So we thought it'd be good to give our user base some pro tips on how to approach these workflows. After the discussion of each topic today, I'm going to stop for just a minute or two to answer any questions that might have come up. So you can send your questions to our webinar host, Justine, via the questions function at any time. So please note that there is a question box on the webinar control panel. It's right underneath the audio section. And this is where you can type in your question and it'll be sent over to the webinar host who can then forward it to me to answer. And hopefully we have enough time to answer everybody's questions. But if we don't get to your question, we will reply via email after the webinar is over. So if you notice that your control panel is minimized and you don't see that questions section, you can go up to the view menu and uncheck auto hide the control panel, and this will allow you to view that entire panel. So we're also recording today. So after the webinar is finished, we will be posting a video recording of today's presentation on our support website at support.goldensoftware.com. All right. So specifically today, I'm going to be walking everyone through the workflow on visualizing cross-sections in Strater. We're going to start off with creating a cross-section from LAS data, imported as line symbol logs, and we're also going to touch on the scheme editor for a moment. Then I'm going to move on to creating a cross-section from a lithology and zone bar logs. And we'll also talk about how to add a water level in this process. And I'm going to move on to talk about creating cross-sections from raster logs, and we'll discuss hanging logs on elevation. And then also we'll discuss how to add a ground surface and create your own layers. Okay. So there's a ton of information to cover today. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so a cross-section is an interpolation of what a discrete data measurement, which is commonly lithology, is doing between your wells. So in Strater, a cross-section can be created from lithology zone bar logs, line symbol logs, or raster, depth registered raster data. And we can create these by creating a well selector on the well map, or using a couple other processes. And so I'll show you those in just a moment. So once we create a cross-section, we can reshape layers, show the wells are deviated, reference the well tops to hang them on a mean sea level, or even on a specific layer. And I will be showing you some examples of this throughout the course of the presentation today. All right, so for our first example, I'm again going to create a line symbol log cross-section that's based on LAS data. So the first thing I need to do is to open the location collars information into a new table. And then I also need to import the LAS data into a single depth table. So we start out with the collars table because it's required to create a cross-section and for any of these different data types or log types, because it's the only piece of information or table that contains the well top. Okay, so that top XY coordinates and the elevation. All right, so to get started here, I'm going to go up to the File menu and click File Open. Okay. I'm going to navigate to my data here, and the first thing I'm going to do is select my collars table. Okay, so with the collars table selected here in the Open dialog, I'm going to click Open, and this is a multiple table worksheet. So I'm going to make sure that I select the appropriate table and click OK. All right, and so now we see the Specify Worksheet column definitions page of the dialog. So the first thing I need to do because I do have some headers here in my data. You can see that if I scroll over, I'm going to want to go ahead and check the specify column header row. And that's going to allow for easier field mapping on the next page. I'm going to go ahead and click next. And now we see the specify data type and column positions page of the import dialog here. All right, so the first thing I need to do is tell Strater what type of information I'm importing. So I can set the data type dropdown for this specific data set. Again, we're working with the collars table. So I'm going to set this to collars. And you should notice that my predefined column definitions dropdowns here have changed to the required fields for a collars table. I'm going to go ahead and set the appropriate settings here. For example, well ID for our hole ID. Our starting depth, I'm going to use the Kelly bushing location. The ending depth, I'm going to use our total depth column. For elevation, I'm going to use the datum sea level. And then I'm also going to set the easting and northing. This can be true easting and northings, or it can be lat long. And so for this example, I'm actually using lat long. So for my easting, which is going to be the x coordinate inside of Strater, I'm going to set that to long. Okay, and of course we remember that x is always long and y is always lat. I'm going to go ahead and set those appropriately. And then just wanted to comment really quick, the default column definitions shown on these pages, on this part here in the specify column definitions portion of the dialog. These are going to be the required fields, okay? And so if we did have deviated bores, I would need to, boreholes, we would need to set the inclination and azimuth, okay? And then we also have a scale setting. Since my data doesn't contain these, I'm going to go ahead and leave these blank. All right. I'm going to go ahead and click finish. And we can see that our collars table has now been added to the project inside of Strater. And you can see here I've got easting, northing, which again is long lat, elevation, starting and ending depth. And then there was some other information that was included in the table, like some notes and some other information that was also imported. And this was appended to the end of this defined table structure here inside of Strater. All right, and so I'm going to go back up into the ribbon here and import the LAS data. Okay, but first I'm going to create a new table. So in the home ribbon, I'm going to click new and then click our table icon. This is going to allow me to import the LAS data as a depth table. All right, so now we see the create new table dialog. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is name our table here LAS data, and we're going to create a depth table to import this LAS data into, or line log data. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click create to create our new table. And now that we've created a new table here, I can import the LAS data directly into this table. Okay. To do so, I can click File, Import Data. Okay, and again, this is going to import data into the active table. And in the Import Data dialog, I don't have to do this one at a time. I'm going to go ahead and use Control-click here and select all of my LAS files. And then click Open. And we see the Import Options dialog. The first thing I want to do here is I'm going to tell Strater to import the well data. And to do so, I'm going to create a separate table of this information. So I can click the Create Table button. And Strater prompts me for a new table name. I'm going to title this table for the well info, LAS info, and click OK. You can see that's been added here. And then before I click next, I want to use the same settings for all the LAS files. So I'm going to check the use same settings for subsequent LAS files or LAS files option. Okay. And this is going to tell Strater to apply these same import parameters to all of the LAS files. And click next. And now I see the import data into the current table page here of the dialog. All right, so I'm going to move down to the create columns from source. Okay, and this is what this is going to do, is going to add all of our parameters we have for each one of these line logs into our current table. Okay, and so when I click that, it's a little hard to see here, but we can see all of these fields have now been added. The only thing I need to do is to make sure that I have the depth set to the correct table. I have it highlighted over here on the import source data columns. And I'm simply going to click the little arrow button. You can see our depth table here has now been added for depth. All right, and I can go ahead and import this data into our tables here. So I'm going to give Strater just a second to think. All right, you can now see that we have our LAS info table with our 4 LAS files. And then we have the actual curve data here. And this is listed. As I scroll down, you should notice that that well ID or the whole ID is changing. All right, and so we do have all of our LAS data here in this particular table. All right, so let's go ahead and create the cross section from this data. I'm going to go back up to the ribbon and click on the Home tab. Go to the new section, and I'm going to create a new blank cross-section view. Okay, there we go. We can see we have a blank palette here to create our cross-section on. And this can be easily done by going up to this new tab that's been added to our cross-section view and click Create Add, and then go over to the Create Cross-Section button. All right, when I do so, I'm going to slide this well selector over just a second here off screen, and you can see that Strater has also created a map view. You can see that here on the map tab, and it's also in our view manager. And what are we looking at here is the tops, point locations of all the wells that were in our collars table. Okay, so again, that's why it's important to start off with the collars table. So we do have that XY location for each well. All right, you can see that I've brought the well selector dialog back here on screen. And you can see that we have all of our available wells and then the wells that are currently in our selector. On this left-hand side of the dialog, this is going to tell Strater which wells we're going to use for the cross-section. All right, we really don't want to use all of these, so I'm going to go to the minimum button, which reduces my list to the top 2 wells. Okay, and of course you do need at least 2 wells to create the cross-section. And I'm going to move over to the right-hand side and select the wells that I want to add or use for our cross-section. And I can use the control key to multi-select wells here. Add one more here. And then I'm simply going to click the add button to add them to the selector list. And then of course we don't want to use these other 2 that were originally on here. So I'm going to click the remove button and remove those from our well selector list. And you can see now which wells we're going to use for the cross section. Now before I click OK, I'm going to reorder our wells here by using the simple drag and drop so I get them in the order I want. So going top to bottom, this is going to draw these wells left to right in the cross section. Okay. Now that I have the particular order I want to use, I can go ahead and click OK. I'm going to click yes, and we see the import cross sections data dialog. All right, so the first thing I need to do here, again, we're working with line symbol logs and LAS data, is I need to tell Strater what kind of cross-section we're creating. In the drop-down menu here, we have all three variables, or variations rather: lithology, zone bar logs, line symbol logs, and then our raster logs. I'm going to set this to line symbol log. That's the type of data that we're working with for this first example. All right, and then what I need to do is pick the particular variable or curve that I want to use for each one of our wells here. I'm going to set this to SP. All right, as you can see, I have all the parameters that you would expect to see in an LAS file. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And next we see the import layer marks. For this example, we're not going to use this control, so I'm going to uncheck the specify layer data. And then go ahead and click OK. And you can see now that Strater has created line logs for each one of these wells. Okay. All right. All right, so now that I've created logs for each one of the wells, right, from our LAS data, I need to pick our tops, right, for each layer. In Strater, this can be done a few different ways, but one of the ways is by importing a layer marks table. All right, so I'm going to go over to our object manager and make sure that I have our cross section selected, simply just by clicking on it. Then I'm going to go back up to the ribbon and click cross section. In the layer mark section, I'm going to click the import command. Okay, and so this means I can import an external file that I've already created of our layer marks. All right, so I'm going to select my data file and click open. Again, this is a multi-sheet workbook, so make sure that I select the appropriate sheet here, which is our top sheet, and click OK. And next I see the specify worksheet columns definitions dialog. Of course, we've seen this dialog just a few minutes ago. And I do have a header row, so I'm just going to make sure that specify column header row is checked, of course, and then I'm going to go ahead and click next. And we see the specified data type and column positions dialog. All right, so I'm going to be importing the layer marks as a depth table. So I'm going to make sure that I have this data type set to depth, single depth, and verify my well name is set for whole ID and the depth is set to the appropriate column. And go ahead and click finish. All right, so now I see the select layer marks column dialog. And in here we select the parameter to base these layers on. Okay, that I only had one parameter or one column here that would work. So I'm going to leave that set to rock unit. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see that the layer lines are now generated between each line log. So we did see briefly there what columns required for when importing the layer marks table. But I'm going to tab over real quick to our top table, our layer mark table, so you can take a look at really what this looks like. Okay. All right, and so you can see that I have whole ID for all four of the LAS files that I created. I have a depth, and then what formation or group is found at that specific depth. Okay, and this is what Strater uses to define those layers. Okay. All right, and so I had again created this file prior to the presentation. Okay, but we could also do this manually inside the cross section if needed. So back on that cross section view, I would like to fill the layers and take a look at the scheme editor real quick. Okay. And again, the scheme editor is used when creating cross sections of any log type. All right. So I'm going to go up to the ribbon and click Home, Display, Scheme Editor. Okay. When I click the button, you can see the Scheme Editor dialog. At the very bottom, you can see a row of icons, and this is where I can create a new scheme to apply fill patterns and colors to our logs and our layers. So at the very left-hand side, there's a new scheme button. I'm going to go ahead and create a new scheme here. In our new scheme dialog, I want to tell Strater to base our scheme on the specific tops table that we're using, right? And that rock unit column that we were just looking at, right? And so what this will do is create a scheme with all those different rock types or keywords that we saw in that rock type column. Excuse me, rock unit column. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see our custom scheme has now been added to the scheme editor. So when I expand it, you can see all of these different parameters here or keywords. And then these were randomly assigned. And you can see this as I click down over here. These were randomly assigned a solid fill and also a random color. Okay. Of course, we can edit these if we want. I'm not going to go through that each one of these one by one today because of time restraints, but I will show you loading a different scheme here in my next example. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK and give Strater just a moment to think here. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and fill these by clicking on our layers here in the object manager. I'm going to move down to the property manager. And I'm going to change our keyword scheme to the custom one we just created. And then also I'm going to choose to fill between our layer lines. Of course, this is going to apply that random coloring, which again is fully editable through that color scheme, or excuse me, through the scheme editor. But we see that our logs are now filled, or our layers are now filled between the line logs. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and show you my next example here in just a moment of creating a cross section from a lithology, a zone bar log. But first I wanted to take a break for just a second or two to see if we have any questions that come up thus far. So if you have any questions, please, by all means, send those on over to Justine so we can get them answered. All right, so the first question I have is, can I add a custom fill pattern? That's a great question. And to answer your question, I'm going to go back to the scheme editor. We can select any one of these. For example, I've selected this basement complex unit. I can go over to the fill section here and click the ellipses button. Change the fill type to an image, and then I can load this from a file. And then we can also create a number of different types of fill patterns here in this fill style editor. This is highly documented, so please look for any information in our knowledge base of how to create these different fill patterns, but it can be all done here in this fill style editor. Okay, so great question. All right, so my next question is, someone asked about how to, thank you, Justine, to show the distance between the wells. So I'm going to close the scheme editor here, and I am going to look at my layers. And let's see here for my cross section. I can do for my layers. It's definitely possible, and let me show you how to do that. shortly. Okay, so I'm going to click my cross-section tab here, and I can use my create, add, and add well headers. And if I zoom in here, you're going to see that the label's a little hard to see. If you remember, I was using lat long data, so this is not going to show anything but lat long here, which is not very useful, decimal degrees. But let's say that our map was in something besides lat long, like UTM meters, maybe state plane feet, you would see the appropriate distance. So again, that's adding the well header here, right here in the create add section on the cross section tab. Okay, I have time for one other question, and the question is, can the keywords be anything that you want, or is there a set of recognized terms in Strater? I really like this question. We do get this a lot on our support team. So to answer this, I'm going to go back over to our tops or our layer marks table, if you will. And you can see here's all of our keywords here. These can actually be any alphanumeric keyword as long as, and then when we go back to our cross section here, as long as they match what is shown here in the scheme. And if you look, those were one-for-one matching. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on here to my next example. All right, and so this next example is going to be based on how to create a cross-section from a lithology log or a zone bar log, in which these are very similar log types. The lithology log allows for weathering and indentation on one side. That's about the only difference between the two log types. All right, and so the steps are going to be the same for each log. So it doesn't really matter if you're using lithology or zone bar. This workflow will apply to both. All right, and so really that means the beginning of the creation process for the cross section is going to be the same regardless of the log types that you're using. All right, so this approach is going to be a little bit different. First, I'm going to start off with creating the cross section view. All right, so I'm going to go up to the ribbon and click Home, New, Cross Section View. All right, and so again, we see that blank palette to create our cross section on. All right, so the next thing I want to do is go back up here to the ribbon and click cross section, create, add, and click the create cross section button. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click it. And you should have noticed that we haven't imported our callers table yet. And so I'm doing this to show you that there's various ways to approach this. Okay, and so since I haven't imported the colors table and I'm trying to create a cross section, Strater automatically prompts me for a colors table. All right, I'm going to go ahead and select my data file, which is this Excel file here, and click open. Again, I want to make sure that I select the right table here or right page for my or right sheet for my multi-sheet Excel file. I'll be working with the collars table. And again, we see that specify worksheet column definitions. All right, so I'm going to make sure that I have that column header row selected and click next. And then before I click finish here, I want to make sure that I have all of the mapping done correctly from the Excel file into that standardized internal table structure inside of Strater. So I'm just going to verify these real quick. Everything looks good, so I'm going to click finish. And again, I'm going to move this over just a little bit. So we saw this just a few minutes ago with the first example. Strater automatically creates a well map and opens up this well, the create well selector dialog. Okay, and so again, we've seen this dialog, but all of the available wells here, which is, we've got a ton more than that first example. And of course, we wouldn't want to create a cross section. It would be much too busy between all of our wells. So what we're going to do, use a similar process as we did earlier. Okay, Then I'm going to click the minimum button. That's going to drop the list down in the selector list on the left-hand side to only 2 wells. Okay, and then we're going to select the wells that we want to add here to our cross section. I'm going to add a few wells here. And then again, we're going to remove these 2 that were left over here. And again, if we wanted to change the drawing order left to right, which is again top to bottom here in the well selector list, we could use drag and drop. All right, and again, that topmost well is going to be the leftmost well in the cross section, and then you're going to see that bottom one is going to be the rightmost well in the cross section we're going to create. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And next we see the import cross-section data dialog. First thing I need to do is set the cross-section log type. I need to make sure that I have it set to Lithology zone bar log, which is, of course, that's the type of data that we're working with at this point. Again, I want everybody to note that regarding the Lithology or zone bar log, these steps are going to be identical. All right, so now that I have the cross-section log type here set, I need to next verify that the table and columns are set properly for each one of the wells. Okay, and so let's say if I haven't loaded the data yet, I can go over to this action column here in the dialog and click the import data button. Okay, and so once I do so, I see the import data dialog. I'm going to select my well data again and click open. And make sure that I only have the lithology data selected. Okay, and click OK. This will allow me to import that lithology data inside into the Strater project. I'm going to click next. All right, and I'm going to make sure that I set my data type here. We're importing lithology. All right, so I'll make sure I set that to lithology. Got the whole ID from to our lithology keyword column. I don't have any lithology description here in my table or any of these other items, which is okay. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK, or excuse me, finish. When we move this over, you can see that my table was created. All right, and so now we see the import cross-section data dialog. And you can see that I don't need to perform that same action for the other wells. Strater is smart enough to use that that whole ID or that unique identifier that we've been defining to perform that same action for the other wells. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see that the cross section is now created with a default color scheme here. All right. I'm going to go up to the Home tab, and I'm going to launch our scheme editor again. I'm not a huge fan of what we're seeing here color-wise and fill pattern-wise, so I'm going to go ahead and load another scheme here by clicking this Open Scheme button right here at the bottom of the scheme editor. First, I'm going to load my lithology. It puts it by default in the wrong area. I'm going to use the convert between keyword scheme and lithology scheme to move that up here. And then I'm going to take a look at this really quick. And you can see as I click down that these This is actually a customized scheme here, right? And then I'm also going to load one more scheme that we can use for the layers themselves. Again, this time I'm using a very similar one. And I'm going to move this down to our lithology keyword section. Again, verify it really quick. Okay, everything looks okay. So I can go ahead and click OK. And now I can change the way the logs look, color scheme wise, by simply selecting the log object in the object manager, that logs layer, moving down to the property manager and on the logs tab. All right, I can change it to the scheme that I just loaded. Okay, you can see here on my wells, and if I undo our layers here, you can see those bills. Okay, and then I'm going to repeat the same process here, except this time for my keyword scheme, I'm going to use our lithology keyword scheme that I created. Of course, these are based on the same keywords, and we get a much better looking cross section. All right. So now, before I open it up for any questions, I'm going to show you how to add a water level, okay, into this cross section. Now, in order to add a water level, we're going to need to have a depth table. So I'm going to import it now by clicking the File, Open command. I'm going to select my well data file again and click Open. This time selecting the appropriate table and clicking OK. And you can see the specified worksheet column definitions dialog here. Looks good. I'm going to click Next. Of course, making sure our data type is set correctly. It's a simple depth table. You can see it's a very, very simple table here. And I'm going to click Finish. And you can see now that this depth table that we're going to use to show the water level has now been added to the Strater project. So I'd like to show you now how to add water level symbols to the cross section. Okay, so obviously need to tab back over to our cross section view. I'm going to select the logs in the object manager. Move down to the property manager, and we have a water level tab. Okay. Right here at the very top in the general section, we have a checkbox to display that water level symbol. I'm going to go ahead and do so. Okay, nothing's showing up yet, right? You don't see a water level anywhere. That's because I haven't actually defined or told Strater what table to use. That's the only depth table I have in the project. So that's the only one that's listed in the drop-down menu. And you can see that we've added a symbol with a little line where that water level is. It's a little hard to see, so I'm going to go down to the water, scroll down on the water level tab here in the properties and change my fill here, right, to black, right, and you get a better idea of where that water level is located. All right, so one last thing I want to do, I'm going to slide this over just to get a little bit more real estate right here. And then it's always good to insert a depth log so we can get a good indication of where this cross section is sitting per the actual depth. All right, so I'm going to open it back up for some questions. I just have a minute or two here, so if you want to send your questions on over, please go ahead and do so. All right, so I am, it doesn't look like I have anything that I can answer real quickly, so I am going to go ahead and move on to example 3. I do have a few other examples to do today, so let's take a look at creating a raster log cross-section, and then we're going to hang those logs on the elevation. All right, so with that last example of how to create a cross-section, very similar, we'll walk through the creating cross-section process here, but this time we're going to use raster logs. So we're going to use the same data as this last example. So I'm just going to build on this Strater project. So this time I'm going to create a cross-section using some different wells. All right, and so I don't have a well selector already for this one. And if I click over to the map, you can see the old well selector, or the well selector rather, that I used for that previous example. Make it a little bit thicker. You can see that red line here goes through all 3 wells. And if I zoom in here, you're going to notice it actually doesn't go through the middle of this point. So our cross section did not include that. All right, so on this map, it's really hard to tell which wells are which, right? And so it'd be hard to actually create a well selector without first labeling the wells. We're going to select the wells object, okay, in our object manager. I'm going to go down to the label tab in the property manager, and for label 1, I'm just going to select hole ID. All right. It's still a little bit hard to see. We've got some overlapping labels here, so I'm going to change the label angle here to about 45. Right. We get rid of a little bit of that overlapping, and then maybe change the font properties by changing the size. However, all these controls are grayed out. That's because I'm using a keyword scheme for the label fonts. So if I click back on that Wells tab here in the property manager, I can uncheck, and I can go back to our label tab, and now all of my parameters are available, right? And make those well labels just a little bit smaller so they're not overlapping. All right, so for this next example and this approach to creating the cross-section, what we're going to do at this point is we're going to start out with creating the well selector line itself. All right, so up in the tab, the map tab here in the ribbon, I'm going to click Add and Well Selector. All right, and so as I hover over each well, you can see there's a little tooltip that comes up, and I'm going to click on the first well and double click on my second well that I want to include in the cross section. Again, click the escape key to get back to a normal functioning mode, and you can see now in the object manager that our new well selector has been added. And of course, we can make this a little bit easier to see here just by changing the color of that well selector line and increasing the width just a little bit. All right, so in order to create the cross section, I'm going to go back over to the object manager, and I can simply right click and use create cross section. Okay, when doing so, we see the import cross section data dialog again. Okay, just as the past examples, we need to make sure that we set the cross section log type to the correct type. And then we're going to go over to the action column here and click on this green button. I'm going to select my registration Excel file, okay, and click open. Of course, this is the depth registration for both of our raster logs here. Making sure our column header is specified and clicking next. All right. I'm going to make sure our table is set here to our registration table. I'm going to click OK. And next we see the import layer marks dialog. Okay, I'm going to make sure that our box is checked for specify the layer data. And then again, I'm going to move over here to our action section and click on the green button. And I'm going to select my predefined layers table and click open. next, and finish. All right, I'm going to set this to layers as well, and click OK. And when I click back to the cross section, you can see that now our layers have been connected here between our raster logs. Of course, these were already depth registered. And then our layers are defined here inside of our layers table. All right, back in the cross section, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here. And we can fill these layers if we want, okay, by simply going to the layers object here in the object manager, clicking on the layers tab, and clicking fill between layers. Of course, we get this random coloring here. If we wanted to edit the scheme here, I could simply open this up. And then edit whatever layers that we're seeing here, okay? All right, so I have one last example for everyone today. And so I'm gonna go ahead and go through that example, and then I'll answer any questions that may have came up, time permitting. All right, so for this last example, I'm gonna show you how to draw your own layers and also show how to add a ground surface. And this is somewhat of a custom workflow, but I definitely think it's very useful to know how to do this. So I'm going to cover how to create this cross-section layers manually after I add a ground surface. And sometimes it's better to create them manually than reshape them or use the default layer creation. And then we're in this process, I'm going to show you how to add a ground surface to the cross-section. And both of these workflows are going to use the connect with logs layer feature that we see right here on that cross-section tab. All right, so the first thing I need to do is to show the ground surface. And in order to do so, I'm going to need to have an image that was created outside of Strater that shows the ground surface. And this really works best if the image has a scale, so we can manually fit that to the cross-section. So if you have a series of points that define the topography of your project along that well selector line, rather than an image, you can create a BLN file in Surfer and export as an image. And I don't have time to go over those steps, but it's definitely possible to do inside of Surfer. So before I import this ground surface image, I'm going to switch our logs and show you how to hang these on elevation instead of depth, right? So we see a constant flat depth across the top. And sometimes you might want to show that ground elevation. All right, so what I'm going to do is going to go to the ribbon and click View, Display View Properties. Okay, and this gives me the view properties here in the Property Manager. All right, so I'm going to scroll down and to where I see reference datum, and I'm going to set this to mean sea level. Okay, and so you can see now that we have a little bit of variation across our surface, but we may want to see some ups and downs here, right, instead of these straight lines between wells. Okay, and before I import my image, I have a little bit of an idea because I've done this before of what depth settings I need here. So I'm going to change this to user defined. Okay, and let's start my starting borehole depth at -7, just to give a little bit more space. And I'm also going to change the ending borehole depth to 700. Oop. Okay, so I just get a little more area here inside of my cross-section view. All right, and so before I go any further, I'm going to go into the object manager again. Don't really like the way that these layers were drawn, and so I'm going to show you an example of drawing them manually. So what I can do is I can either turn these off, or I can just simply right click and delete them. All right, so we're back to just seeing the boreholes or the logs themselves. And now I'm going to import that ground surface. So File, Import Graphic, and this will allow me to import any supported bitmap type. Okay, so I can select this ground surface, and it'll be easier once it comes in here for you to see that I've already created again before I started the project. All right, so I can use drag and drop to move these around inside the cross-section view as desired. So what I'm going to do first is find that image here inside of my object manager and move it to the back. All right, so I can see the logs on top of it. There we go. And so now I'm going to manually position, just using the stretching green, these green grips to stretch and position this to where I think it should be appropriately put. All right, and so you can see the scale on one side here. All right, I'm going to try to line this up with the 600 I see on that depth log, and then move the 650 down just a little bit to where it should go. And of course, I'm eyeballing this. It's not perfect, right? But you guys can see how this is fitting across now where the tops of these wells are. All right. Now that I've manually positioned our ground surface image, we're going to go ahead and connect the logs with layers. So making sure that my cross section is selected, I'm going to move up to the ribbon, cross section, create add, and then use this connect logs with layers command. All right. And our top layer is going to be clay, which is, that's just fine. We go ahead and click OK. And you should notice that I have a customized looking mouse pointer. This indicates that I'm in some sort of digitizing mode. So I'm going to start over and zoom in just a little bit here. And what I'm going to do is just click along this ground surface. I'm starting with this very top layer here, and then holding the shift key as I click. All right, and I'm not going to do this perfectly for this example, as this takes a little bit of time with such a detailed surface. But I want you guys to get the gist of how to do this, and then in a second I'll open up a finished product for you. Bring this back into view here. Do this last portion. Again, holding down the shift key so I can click on the surface. All right, and you can see as I double click here, I get that top layer. And of course, I could make this fit a lot better if I was being a little bit more accurate with my clicking. So you don't really want to, and I would repeat this for all the layers inside of the cross section. And then once I'm done, I would go ahead and again, find that image here and delete it by right clicking and choosing delete in the context menu. Of course, when I don't want you guys to sit here while I do a number of clicks, so I'm going to open up a finished product here that I did before the presentation started. And you can get a good sense of what the resulting cross section will look like. Okay, and you can see that I have this nice ground surface going in between the wells instead of that straight top. All right, so I'm going to open it up for just another minute or two. It looks like I have just a few minutes left for any questions that I didn't get answered. All right, so one of the questions I have is, how did I make this surface inside of Surfer? I did mention that. What I did is I had a gridded XYZ grid file that I created a contour map, and actually I gridded the colors table. So right? Just the tops. Made a real simple grid file and then a cross section, and I used the profile tool to create the profile, and then I just exported it. All right, so I have a question here first. Let's see. And I'm trying to get most of these answered as I can, guys. All right. So I have, she's telling me that I have a few, thanks Justine, a few people asking about proportional versus uniform spacing. Yes, you can do that, right? And so these are the true spacing here. You can select the cross section here in the Object Manager, move down to the cross section tab, and let's see, I have a well spacing setting here, proportional uniform. Uniform is just going to make them evenly spaced. I think if I change this, it's going to remove my layers. So you want to make sure that you uncheck the customize layers. Right. Of course, that does change my layers a little bit, but it still looks good. You may need to do some reshaping when doing this towards the bottom. All right, so it does look like we're right up against the hour here. So that's going to conclude my presentation of the Strater cross-section crash course webinar. Hopefully everyone found the information I covered today useful. So if you have any additional questions now that the webinar is ending, or anything else Strater related, you can contact our technical support team at support@goldensoftware.com. And again, we did record the webinar today, and we'll be posting a recording on our support website as soon as we can. And on behalf of Golden Software, I want to thank everyone very much for your time, and have a nice afternoon.